Richard Valencia starts off chapter 3 by talking about the culture of poverty, which was coined by Oscar Lewis. Lewis describes the culture of poverty as referring to the poorest of the poor, um, the people with the least socioeconomic status. The culture of poverty suggests that poverty is a way of life and that people choose to be impoverished. Based off of Lewis's culture of poverty, uh, based off of Lewis's culture of poverty, many different researchers took this and kind of ran with it. It was appropriated many times and often used to misrepresent those those with low socioeconomic status. Valencia then goes on to talk about Ruby Payne's A Framework for Understanding Poverty, and criticizes the main ideas in her research. He talks about how, in Payne's A Framework for Understanding Poverty, she discusses hidden rules of poverty and notes that there are 8 different types of resources, including financial, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical, support systems, relationships, role models, and knowledge of the hidden rules. She then goes on to state that people who are in poverty possess dysfunctional attributes and behaviors. And she kind of generalizes all people in poverty. She doesn't exactly say that this is something that happens sometimes, or she doesn't give any percentages or any statistics based on who has these dysfunctional behaviors. Payne then goes on to say that language plays a big part in poverty, and that students who live in poverty don't possess the language required to be successful in this world, and that they act out what they're trying to say through behaviors such as like fighting and violence and things like that. Payne also goes on to describe discipline and says that in poverty, discipline is about penance and forgiveness, not necessarily change. She relates this back to discipline within schools, and kind of suggests what schools should be doing when it comes to disciplining children, considering that being successful, so-called, in schools requires self-control. After Valencia discusses Payne's work and kind of describes everything that she talks about in her book, he goes on to criticize Payne for her lack of support and research when it comes to the claims that she has. After discussing Payne's work, Valencia goes on to criticize and provide his own evidence and research on why Payne's work isn't the best example for dealing with kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds. He points out that a lot of her work involves stereotyping and misconceptions about those living in poverty. He also goes on to talk about how she herself doesn't provide enough research or evidence to back up the sweeping claims that she made in her work. And Valencia also goes on to talk about deficit thinking within her work.
In Chapter 4, At-Risk Students or At-Risk Schools, Valencia begins by discussing the historical origins of the construct of being at risk. He describes various definitions and qualifications for being at risk. A qualification of being at risk is when children with severe diseases, physical handicaps, or children who are delinquent, neglected, and illegitimate and abused. An historical example was during the U.S. colonial period, Puritans prioritized baptism and salvation. Children who weren't baptized were considered at risk. Valencia also discussed the 3 disciplines which contribute to the construct of at risk. The first one being medical and public health. So, for instance, in schools, vaccinations and screenings are used to prevent health risks. The second discipline is child psychology and early education. Programs such as Head Start aim to intervene in the lives of children who are considered to be at risk. And the third discipline is child welfare and social policy. This is shaped by socio-political forces, according to Valencia, and has historical roots. An example of child welfare and social policy would be segregation, poverty, and language barriers. Valencia then went on to discuss the excellence movements in the 1980s. And the first one was The Nation at Risk, the imperative for educational reform. And its goals were to increase standards and expectations for students and teachers, so a merit-based salary, and to increase time allocated to learning, to increase administrative involvement, and to increase competition, but there was no focus on issues of equity. So to refute that, there was the barriers to excellence, are children at risk. The focus of that was that schools are the problem and not the students, and that there should be a focus on systemic reform and less discrimination and the implementation of more student-centered programs. So both of those movements seek to improve the educational system, but have different methods and mindsets. A Nation at Risk blames lazy students and teachers, while Barriers to Excellence blames the unfair system. So then Valencia discusses early at-risk discourse. There are various definitions of at-risks and opinions about deficit thinking. An example would be that at-risk factors are only indicators of at-risk populations rather than definitions. Another perspective was that it is possible for at-risk students to find success, and then another focus was that we should help students and families, but there was no discussion about addressing the systemic issues or the problems in the educational system. They're just focusing on the problems at home and with the children. And with contemporary at-risk discourse, there's more acknowledgement of deficit thinking and systemic issues. We need to fix the system and not blame students and families. Valencia then discusses at-risk schools, and he says that there needs to be a major paradigm shift about the at-risk notion. He discusses the relation between teacher quality and student academic performance. He says that yes, low-income communities and schools cannot afford the best teachers or permanent teachers, and that this does affect student academic performance because students often form relationships with teachers, and when teachers are underqualified or not permanent, those student and teacher bonds are not as likely to form. And then finally, Valencia discusses the inequities, and he mentions several court cases in which there was unequal distribution of teacher quality and supplies among students, and how poor students and students of color were especially negatively impacted, and they are not given the same amount of resources as upper or middle class students. So to summarize, by saying that students are at risk, we put the blame on them. We need to be addressing the oppressive education system, which makes it hard for students to succeed, and focus less on what the students are doing wrong and the problems with their home lives, and we need to focus more on how we can address the foundation and the major issues. And I do agree with Valencia's perspective.
Valencia discusses deconstructing deficit thinking in Chapter 5. He starts off the chapter talking about pre-service teacher education. He points out that many people going to school for teaching are white, and once they complete their education, they end up working in urban school settings with majority children of color. He goes in depth on different studies that were done. Valencia discusses studies on these serve as teachers and how whiteness and white racism affect their interactions with students. And it's shown that a lot of them have deficit thinking, low expectations for their students, and oftentimes stereotypical views of the children that they're teaching. He then goes on to discuss the importance of parental engagement in not only the classroom but the school as a whole. And he discusses how oftentimes the school system prevents the engagement necessary from parents for their children to have a meaningful educational experience. He discusses how teachers and principals and schools in general need to replace the stereotypes that they have of parents who come from low socioeconomic statuses. Valencia also discusses replacing the stereotypes of low socioeconomic status parents with recognition of their strengths. These parents are not only a valuable resource to the community, but also to the school as a whole. And he suggests that the best way that they can help is to not only give them the minimal roles, such as filling out permission slips and stuff like that, but also participatory roles where they're coming in and speaking about the career that they do, or they're helping out with something that they have a lot of knowledge or background in. He then goes on to talk about educational leadership, and in that section, it's mainly about how teachers need to dismantle their deficit thinking, and he talks about two different types of equity traps. The first one being a deficit view, and this equity trap is basically blaming children for their lack of achievement, and saying that it's things such as poor motivation or laziness or inadequate cultures. And then he also talks about paralogical beliefs and behaviors as another equity trap, and that's basically saying, coming to a conclusion about something in a way that's not logical. It doesn't make sense. Logically, you wouldn't come to that conclusion normally. So he talks about those equity traps, and then he doesn't exactly give set ways on how to prevent these equity traps. He just kind of points out that it's important for them to be gotten rid of, especially for teachers and principals and anyone working with children in a school setting. He also talks about social justice and how social justice and its background, and how oftentimes social justice pushes to eliminate oppressive systems within our country or within our world. And he also talks about the pressures against social justice. He brings up deficit thinking and how it's something that most people have. It's something that most people think, the classist ideas that are portrayed throughout the book are something that most people have. He also talks about the marginalization of types of difference, and When reading this, what came to my mind is kind of like color blindness and people saying, oh, I don't see color. And that kind of takes away from important topics like race and how that affects people's lives. And he also talked about the different types of policies and how those can make it extremely hard for social justice to be successful or even to exist. Valencia then goes on to talk about how leadership for social justice is enacted, and you can, in an educational setting, and you can see it through an increase in student achievement, the improving of the structure of schools, so the way that schools went about implementing different programs or the types of training that teachers received. Valencia also talked about strengthening school culture and community, and kind of went into how important the community is when it comes to education, and how when you strengthen one, you strengthen the other. As for agreeing or disagreeing, I agree with Valencia. He provides many different ways to deconstruct deficit thinking.
So in the conclusion, Valencia discusses bankruptcy of the standards-based school reform movement. He discusses accountability and how right now standardized testing is used to hold the school accountable for meeting high standards and getting good test scores. He also discussed several criticisms of the standards-based reform movement, one of them being of the measurement-driven instruction. Using testing to manipulate what is taught and how it is learned, also known as teaching to the test, is not an appropriate way of teaching students. Also, decisions should be based on more than just test scores. Many factors contribute to students' successes and scores, and when addressing students and teachers, there are so many factors that play into it other than just test scores. There's also an adverse impact on students of color. Minority students do much worse than white students. And he also discusses the impact of Campbell's law, which is when stakes are high, corruption follows. Or another criticism is structural misdirection. Blame is being placed on individuals rather than the corrupt system. So in order to construct a meaningful school reform, he discusses the democratic education. And the objectives of that are experiencing democracy to understand it, exercising citizenship to develop skills required of informed and responsible citizens, democracy has equal access to an optimum learning environment, and the nature of classroom activity, in which studies show that students perform better with democratic authority rather than other forms of authority. He also discusses the importance of inclusion. Now, all students need to be included in classroom activities, and that there needs to be a meaningful curriculum. So victims of deficit thinking are less likely to participate meaningfully in critical social decisions. We need to get rid of the competitive advantage theory. There also needs to be development of citizenship skills. The democratic education develops citizenship skills within students. It teaches students to think independently but act collectively. There's also a focus on unalienable rights. The relationship between rights and deficit thinking is emphasized in the democratic education. And finally, equality. Valencia states that equality isn't possible, only equal encouragement. So to summarize, the democratic education is the best solution to deficit thinking in the school system. And whether I agree or not, yes, we need to focus on the dismantling of deficit thinking and creating an equitable learning environment for all students. Okay, so a related article is The Educational Leadership by Lois Weiner. So in that, she describes how deficit thinking doesn't only happen in urban schools, but it is prevalent everywhere. Teachers should think about and discuss their actions, and if they may be deficit thinkers, there needs to be a reframing of how teachers and curriculums understand, and deal with perceived behavioral issues. It is important, though, not to put all of the blame on teachers. As a society, we have an obligation to address and challenge the issues our education system faces. We need to acknowledge the strengths of both teachers and students while focusing on breaking through the deficit thinking paradigm.
Our second related resource is called Segregation and the Underrepresentation of Blacks and Hispanics in Gifted Education, Social Inequality and Deficit Paradigms by Donna Y. Ford. And in this research, Donna Ford basically looks at inequality when it comes to gifted education. She argues that social inequality, deficit thinking, and microaggressions contribute to the inequality. And she also argues that the underrepresentation of these children of color is actually directly caused by the attitudes and beliefs that are grounded in deficit thinking among those in power. I found this article interesting because it provides information on the students that are achieving at where they need to be or even above. They're not receiving an equitable education to those that are on the same achievement level as them because of things like low socioeconomic status or race or microaggressions and the deficit thinking that many people have. Our third related resource is Poverty in Education, a critical analysis of the Ruby Pain phenomenon. And it basically agrees with Richard Valencia's work in that they bring up how pain doesn't provide any resources or how pain doesn't provide any evidence or research to back up what she was claiming, and how her work leads to many misconceptions and stereotypes of children of color, and in turn is actually detrimental to these children. It doesn't exactly help their educational experience. All right, that's it.
All right.